Hi everyone. In preparation for the highly anticipated 2023 Canada Cup International Wheelchair Rugby Tournament, we spotlight a formidable 25-year-old wheelchair rugby national athlete. He's just 8 weeks from the start of the tournament, following a stint in the gym with a hypertrophy program, building his muscle mass and also his aerobic base. Today we're going to cover the next 8 weeks leading up to the tournament and discuss specific sports requirements and considerations for this population. Now, in terms of injuries and things to consider for us physiotherapists, the shoulder girdle muscles and arm muscles were the most common locations of injuries that were not consulted by a doctor but seemed to have affected play. Shoulder girdle muscles were typically overused, and there were abrasions and trunk bruises to bruises to the trunk and legs in majority of athletes, and this was looked at by Burfend in 2015 over a 9-month period in the Polish national wheelchair competitions. Some other common injuries were subluxations and overload or overuse of the shoulder and upper limb musculature. Some safety considerations to keep in mind away from the musculoskeletal side of things. Considering the possibility of sensory deficits is very important in those that are disabled. Considering comfortable clothing and thermoregulation is a must. Gripping and the ability to grip for most of these athletes can be altered. So thinking about mitts and modified handles to accommodate gripping with strength training. And there should be a spotter at all time in the gym, by the way. For those specific conditions like muscular dystrophy, high intensity exercise may be something that's kind of disputed. So we need to think more along the lines of low intensity for this population. In those that have had an amputation, we're thinking about stump health, some protection for that, clothing and potential contact to the stump during play, and some other illnesses. It's important to keep in mind, especially for those with spinal cord injuries, are things like genitourinary illnesses and autonomic dysreflexia. And that can be an emergency, so we need to look out for things like pounding headaches, elevated blood pressure, nasal congestion, slow heart rate, blotching of the skin, and restlessness. Some things to consider there. Now, we're looking at the pre-season program. It'll be consisting of initially a body composition building hypertrophy phase, which this athlete today has already completed. It usually starts with this high levels of volume, and then it drops off towards the competition start date. As you can see in the table there, we've got hypertrophy as the main goal for the first phase, which drops off by the time we reach competition. We need strength at its max in the second phase, and then we're going to take that. We're going to go from hypertrophy, which is muscle fibers, to increasing strength with those newly formed fibers, to then translating that newly formed strength into a functional requirements of the sport. And similar goes with cardiovascular fitness. We're going to build an aerobic base. We're going to take that aerobic base and start to build on our anaerobic base, which is more specific to the sport, with high intensity bouts and wheelchair sprints covered throughout throughout match play. It's also important to understand what a player would be required to do during a game. Players are classified between 0.5 to 3.5. As a sample, I've put up there a class 3.5, which is probably the most able. So they've got good trunk and lower limb function. So they're the major ball handler, playmaker. They have some trunk flexion, so they're very stable in the wheelchair. So this will be your more functioning athlete on the field. And because of their excellent ball control, they kind of dictate play. So it's important to understand that. They may have asymmetrical arm or hand function, so keeping that in mind as well. They might have a dominant arm over the other. Now, getting into our exercise program. So I think it's important to understand that prehabilitation should be implemented on an individual basis. More of the common exercises include external rotation, internal rotation, resistance exercises with therabands or cables. So they may have deficits in strength or endurance there. Serratus pushes, so those with overactive upper traps and wing scapula, we're thinking about serratus pushes quite regularly with our throwers and our playmakers. Thoracic spine mobility, and shoulder retractions in isolation. So we're making sure they're able to control their shoulder blade through range. A common warm-up for an exercise session would include arm circles, shoulder rolls, trunk twists for mobility, wrist flexor and extensor stretches, and overhead arm reaches. So you can imagine most of these guys sitting all day, might be on a computer, might be playing games, and then they go and play a sport. You want to make sure they're taking their arms and joints through range of motion before they participate at high levels. Now, here's a sample exercise program. We've got a seated chest press. Those with an amputee, I know the Paralympians can strap themselves to a bench, but seated chest press might be more specific to the sport. Dumbbell shoulder press, single arm weighted side raise, and as you can see in the picture on the right there, there's a modified grip, so something to keep in mind. There's a really nice way around it there, and I think it's a TheraBand there, so it adds a little bit of control around the glenohumeral joint. Single arm seated rows, which is another picture on the right there. Tricep pull downs and wheelchair push sprints weighted, so we can add some resistance to the wheelchair and build a bit of strength there. Now, with these exercises in the phases leading up to competition, we want to be picking 2 compound movements. So the first 2, doing it at 80% of 1 rep max, roughly, and low reps and low sets with a lot of rest in between. And then we might finish the workout with the last 4 exercises trying to maintain body composition. So we might do sets of 8 to 12 in a hypertrophy manner, trying to maintain some body muscle mass as we endeavor to increase their strength. Now, wheelchair rugby is a Paralympic sport and it requires players to work for 8-minute quarters. It's physically demanding and it involves frequent, intermittent, high-intensity movements, such as repeated high-speed sprints and changes of direction. Now, these movements they're separated by brief periods of low intensity. So I think the aerobic base that we've already built is really important for the low intensity bit, so we can really recover. And then now we're looking at developing our anaerobic system to repeat high intensity bouts, so we can win matches and perform. Now, in a study done by Rhodes, Mason, and Perrat, it was concluded that 31% of time was spent in 20% VO2 max, 47% between 21 and 50, 20% at 51 to 80, and 1.5% at that high range. So it's important to consider this when prescribing exercise. Most of our exercises in this phase leading up to competition would be sport specific. A really good exercise would be wheelchair sprints. So we could do 1 minute on, 30 seconds off, or we could even do 30 seconds on, 15 off, and so forth. And then we really want to make sure that they're developing their agility drills. So putting out cones and going in and out between cones over the course of 20 to 30 meters. And we're going to be evaluating our performance in the cardiovascular realm by performing the 30 to 15 intermittent fitness tests, and that's been proven to be an efficacious test by Kelly in 2018 to monitor performance and cardiovascular fitness. Just going back to strength, we're going to be evaluating strength and performance by doing I'd say 5 rep max test might be suitable for this population. For those that are more comfortable to do a closer to 1 rep max could be an option. But just for safety and keeping in mind that most of the injuries occur in the upper limb, 5 rep max might suffice. Now, thank you for listening in. If you have any questions, please get in touch.